Okay, so the objective of the talk today is to give you an introduction to ontologies from the point of view of computer science. So if I understand correctly, most of you who are here are from philosophy. Is that the case? Okay, so when I got the email, it sounded like there was also going to be perhaps mathematicians and logicians and computer scientists. So I kind of tried to make the talk work for maybe everyone. So we'll see how it works. If you have questions or if there are points that you'd like me to go over more, then feel free just to ask. We're a small group, and so we can definitely make it interactive. I've tried mostly to make it not too formal, but at the same time I know some people in philosophy are quite familiar with logic, depending on which part of philosophy they come from. So I also do have some formulas to give a little bit of the ideas of what's behind it, the machinery. But if you don't know a lot about logic, it should still be possible to follow the main examples and the intuitions. Okay, so we'll see how it goes. Okay, so to begin, what is an ontology? Well, this already is a bit of a controversial question. You have your ontologies in philosophy, as far as I understand it. So going to Wikipedia, it's going to ask you, do you want ontologies in philosophy or ontologies in computer science? And if you click philosophy, then you'll get something like this definition here. I don't claim to be an expert, maybe it's a good definition, maybe it's not, but essentially it corresponds to some branch of philosophy that has been studied since basically forever, which is concerned with the nature of existence, what things exist, what objects, which things, okay? In computer science, we have perhaps a bit more narrow point of view. Our objectives are different, and there an ontology is going to be a formal specification of the knowledge, usually in some particular well-defined domain. And why we want it to be formal is that we want it to be amenable to machine processing. So we actually want to be able to give this formal description to the computer to be able to do some work on it. So we'll see afterwards what are the types of tasks we'd like the computer to be able to do with our ontology. So what types of things will go into this specification? Well, first of all, our ontology is going to give us a set of terms. So it's going to define a vocabulary, which won't necessarily cover everything in the domain, but it will cover the relevant concepts that we're going to want to talk about, okay? And afterwards, it's not just going to be a list of terms, it's also going to tell us something about how these terms relate to each other, okay? So for instance, we might say that one term is more specific or more general than another term, that two terms are equivalent, that they're synonyms, that two terms designate disjoint classes of objects, and things like that. So we'll see a lot more examples, but the basic idea is that we define both the vocabulary and the semantic relationships that hold between these terms. Okay, so what is really the point of all this? Why would we want to go and spend all this time to build an ontology? Well, there's several reasons. So the first is that we like to standardize the terminology of an application domain. So even before we start handing it off to a computer, the fact that people sit together and decide what terms they're going to use and what they should mean, so by defining these relationships, so by making explicit what their assumptions are, it means that there's much less chance of misunderstandings once we've been upfront with the terms that we're going to be using. And if we do settle upon some common vocabulary, this is going to make it a lot easier for us to share information. Okay? Now, a related idea is that in the real world, people have data. Okay, we'll see some examples. Say it's medical data, or it's experimental data, or it could just be the products in some database for some online store. I mean, there's all kinds of data that we have. And very often, we'd like to be able to integrate or put together or query several different data sources, but they use different terms. So the information is organized in different ways in these different data sources, and it uses different terms. And so if I'm, as a user, if I want to access all of these different sources of data and different information, then I'm going to have a problem because I would have to learn how the information is represented in all these different places. So the idea is that what I can do with an ontology is I can define one kind of meta vocabulary, and then I can link the terms that happen in these different data sources, in these different information sets, to this global vocabulary. And that means that, well, it's going to make it easier for me to integrate and query different data sources. And it also means that I can introduce in this ontology terms that are going to be relevant to users who are actually going to be posing questions. So the technical terms, the low-level descriptions in the systems might not be very relevant to the user who has a very natural word to describe what they want. And so in this ontology, we're going to introduce all those words that would be relevant for someone who wants to formulate questions. Okay? And they're going to be able to use those, even if in the underlying data sources and the underlying information sets, we might be using other words there. Okay? So we're going to illustrate this in an example in a moment. But one last point. So I said that we're going to want to, once we formalize this ontology, we're going to want to pass it to a computer. And what are we going to ask the computer to do? Well, we're going to want it to reason with our ontology. So the idea is that once we have formalized this description, we're going to be able to ask questions about this ontology. So for instance, we might want to see how different terms are related. Okay, so I might explicitly say that two words mean the same thing or that they're related in a certain manner, but when I put together all of these statements, I might be able to infer new relationships that I did not have explicitly listed. And I want to be able to bring forth these different implicit connections to see what I have actually written down with my ontology. Also, it's actually a very difficult task to build one of these ontologies that accurately represents a domain. And so by doing reasoning and discovering what are the implicit consequences of what we wrote down, we're going to be able to discover errors in modeling and then be able to go and fix them. Okay? And another thing, it's a bit related to perhaps what I said before, but once we put this ontology together and then we have some data, I'm now going to be able to use all of this knowledge that I encoded in the ontology to get back more answers to my queries. So I'll explain this in a moment. Okay, so let's look at two concrete examples of where ontologies are being used nowadays. So the first is in medicine. So there are currently some very large, comprehensive medical ontologies that have been developed by professionals. The most well-known is SNOMED CT, which defines approximately 400,000 terms spanning all areas of medicine. Okay? And then for some more specialized purposes, and here we see that it's quite unfortunate the projector is not really behaving, so we have specialized ontologies. So we have, for instance, this one here is the foundational model of anatomy, and it's going to describe, for instance, the different terms that describe the heart, the different parts of the heart. And here on, okay, improved, good. And on this side here, you actually see in an ontology editor a part of this ontology. And it's a bit hard to read, but here I've actually zoomed into the concept aortic valve, okay, which is what you see here on the picture. And you can see some statements about it. So it's a subclass of cardiac valve. It is a part of the left ventricle. It attaches to the fibrous ring of the heart. I don't know what that is, but you can see here that with our ontology, we're able to describe many different relationships in anatomy. Okay?
Excuse me.
Yes.
May I interrupt?
Yes, you can definitely interrupt.
I just what you describe. I just wonder what is the impact that you call it ontology, because it sounds like kind of traditional picture, like there is kind of huge terminology, it's somehow classified, and it's what you did, but now you call it ontology, what it brings really.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, it's true that if we look at, for instance, just this part here, which is the taxonomy, okay, this type of representation has been studied for a very long time, and it's used, I mean, in all kinds, both in, in anatomy, and we'll see an example on the next slide, in biology. I mean, this type of way of organizing things is very common also in information systems and just really basically everywhere. At some point in time, people decided to call these in computer science ontologies, and some of them actually only are taxonomies, so you could call them just basically taxonomies. And I guess what's new about them is that now we're going to give them to computers and we're going to reason on them. If we only have a taxonomy, the type of reasoning we can do will be very simple. We're just going to basically be able to navigate these subclass relationships, okay? And so the reasoning will be quite simple. However, for a lot of domains, the type of reasoning we want to do is a bit more complex. So we don't only put subclass relationships, we express other types of knowledge. And so our ontologies are not simply a taxonomy, but they go beyond that and they encode other types of knowledge. But how far we go in terms of what kinds of knowledge we can express and how complex it is will really depend. And it's true that nowadays the word ontology is used in a very broad sense, so it englobes both things that basically are just taxonomies all the way up to really complex descriptions that require very complex reasoning to understand. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so this is an example. So what can we do with these ontologies? So how will they actually be used? So there's actually quite a lot of ways that they can be used. So the first is that in many countries there's a push to adopt electronic medical records. So for the longest time, really, medical records really were just written down on paper, which makes it very hard to find anything. Then people moved to computers, but often they were just simple text files, which didn't really have much structure to them. Then in some countries, say in the United States, they introduced a set of codes. So when you wanted to refer to a certain medical condition, you had a code, which was just a set of numbers, basically, that would refer to it. But then there was no relationships between these different codes. So it would still be the case that if you wanted to look for generally a heart condition, it wouldn't be easy because a heart condition would be represented by a huge set of different codes. Okay? And another problem is just simply that a lot of people use different words for different things. So a doctor might want to write down things in, his way. So for instance, to be quick, he might use MI for myocardial infarction. Now the administrator might be looking for those people who have suffered heart attacks, so they're going to be using this more common form. And this here is actually that code that you would use. Okay? And so the idea is that we need to, first of all, we need to be able to express these different ways of saying the same thing. And then we need to be able to express the relationships. So if I'm looking for people who are suffering from heart conditions, I need to be able to pick out that this is a type of heart condition. So that, in effect, is just reasoning on a taxonomy. It's quite simple, but it's already quite necessary if we really want to be able to query medical records. But in some cases, we might want to express more complex conditions. So perhaps I'm looking for patients that are eligible for certain types of medical trials. And then the conditions that these patients must satisfy might be described in a rather complex way, and we might actually have to do some more reasoning in order to be able to identify whether particular patients from their medical records will satisfy the conditions. Also, in addition to querying, it's kind of at the same time we're going to want to exchange. So we'd like that I can, if I've gone to one hospital and then I later go to another hospital, that we can put this together and that these different information systems will work together. So ontologies will help do that. And in fact, this SNOMED has been kind of adopted for the next generation of medical information systems in, say, the United States and the UK. And in fact, several, yes?
Who created it?
So it grew out of efforts, so there was already some professional organizations that were building medical ontologies separately. So I can't remember exactly which ones, but there's some people in the United States and perhaps also some people in the UK. And eventually they decided that they should make this effort international. So they took some existing things and they kind of merged them, and then some other countries became involved. So there's actually an international non-profit organization that works on SNOMED. Okay, so it's now kind of an international effort, and I don't know, there's something like 15 odd countries that are involved in this effort. Yeah.
And it takes them about some years, maybe.
Yes, it's actually very hard work. So again, they built on previous efforts, they already had some existing things that they kind of put together, but it's ongoing, and they're constantly working to extend and improve it, and it's a difficult task. I will touch on some of the issues with that at the very end. Yeah.
It's not difficult, it's damn difficult.
Yes, it's extraordinarily difficult, definitely. Because on the one hand, you need to really have good medical experts, but they typically don't know much about ontologies or computer science. And in general, actually, the way that you represent things, there isn't one way of representing things. There's many design choices, and you need to make sure that you choose a way of representing things that is going to work for what you want to do with it. But there's actually quite a lot of decisions that have to be made, and it's not always obvious how to go about it. And it's very easy to introduce errors and so on, which is why there's a real need for this automated reasoning. Yeah. Okay, and then another thing that can be used, just to give an example, so some people want to for instance, take scans or images of patients, and they want to be able to automatically annotate it or visualize it or turn it around, animate it. So I mean, in a project I'm working on, there's someone who's a professor of anatomy. He's trying to create 3D models, and he didn't really know much of anything about ontologies, but naturally he came across ontologies because he really needed it. So he really needed to be able to organize the terms basically in a taxonomy. That was the main thing that was there, but there were still some other relationships that were needed. And that's actually, although I don't understand all the details, it's extremely crucial for building these different types of tools that people want for being able to get more out of the data. Yeah. Okay, so that's one example. Another example, which is a bit similar, but just to give another idea, is in biology. So as I had mentioned a bit earlier, in biology, people have always been kind of interested in taxonomies and organizing the things that exist in the natural world. So this here is the Linnaeus taxonomy of animals. And it really organizes things in different classes and subclasses and so on, okay? But the importance of taxonomies and more generally ontologies has really grown in recent years, because in biology, people are creating huge amounts of experimental data. And the real problem is becoming, how do we organize and integrate and find the relevant things in all this data? And if people don't pay a lot of attention to how they're representing things, then each person's data is kind of on its own and we can't really do much with it. So we can't get the full value out of all this hard work people put into these experiments, okay? And so the idea is that if we define appropriate ontologies with the terms that people are going to be using, then they can annotate their experiments with these terms, and that means that we can bring together all this data. And that's going to allow people to effectively share their experimental data, to query it. So if someone is interested in what is known about a certain gene, for instance, they want to be able to just ask that question and be able to get back all the studies that are related to it. Okay? To compare data, so another thing that's important is to understand what parameters were used, how is the experiment organized, and there are ontologies now that allow you to specify different aspects of the experiment itself so that you're able to really compare things appropriately, and also to visualize experimental data. So for instance here, when I was trying to look up some sort of graphic that I could put here, so originally I was just going to try and get a little DNA, because that's a classic image. But at the same time, I wanted to get an image that I could properly attribute so I don't get into problems. And when I was looking through this in Google Images, I came across this picture which seemed pretty cool. And what it actually is, so I still have to, of course, attribute it. So this is a genome-wide association study catalog. So I don't know basically anything about genetics, but people are looking at different places. So these are the chromosomes, so just I didn't put all of them here. And they're looking at kind of what has been found, the studies that look at different changes at different places along the chromosomes. And what they wanted was that you can browse what is known but all the little places along the chromosome, okay? And what was kind of interesting is not only is this a cool picture, but when I looked into the little about this browser, they actually say that they use an ontology to produce this image and to guide people in browsing it. So this is actually an interactive tool that you can kind of zoom in on different parts of the chromosome and look for things that you're interested in. Okay. Yeah.
Actually, a question.
Yeah.
Is say given ontology domain specific or not? Is it something which say specifically biological, or it's rather some like Oracle database when you can feed with different kinds of data? Or?
Okay. Well, basically we have. Okay. I guess there's different answers to that question. So, I mean, first of all, in terms of a given ontology, it usually speaks of one particular domain. So here we speak about genes or cells or so on. There are some efforts to make very generic high-level ontologies, but most of the work focuses on more domain-specific ones. Okay, but there is some efforts to be really super generic and define like places and locations and processes and really kind of the basic entities of being. So this maybe is even a little bit closer to what people do in ontology and philosophy, because I think it is inspired by that work. Afterwards, when we get into things that are going to be used in specific applications, then they usually have a much narrower range. I mean, for instance, on the previous slide I had the snowman one. Okay, it's comprehensive, but it's still related to medicine, and it's designed to be useful for things related to medicine. So it's still kind of domain specific, but the domain is very vast. Other ones can be very specific, like I think there's one on like the fly genome, so that's really very, very specific. So really there's the whole range, but I'd say that most of the work nowadays is really on domain ontologies, in that we're not trying to grasp all of everything that exists in the world, but little pieces of it. Now afterwards, the languages that we use to express ontologies and the tools and the editors and all that, these are generic. In that when I'm going to express my ontology, I'm going to choose an appropriate formalism, and we're going to reuse those formalisms over and over again. Later we'll see that we're talking about reasoning. Then we're going to use the same generic reasoning algorithms to deal with ontologies in many different domains. But the actual axioms that we write, okay, that state properties of the domain and that give the terms of the domain, these will typically be specific to one given domain. Okay, so that's just to motivate a bit why we would want to have ontologies and how they're currently being used. So the subtitle of my talk was the description logic approach. So ontologies can be formulated in a variety of different formal languages. And I'm going to be focusing on description logics. First of all, it's my domain of research. It's the one I know best. I like them. But they're also good to illustrate because they are currently one of the most popular means of specifying ontologies. And they're also perhaps more well known for an ontology language they've given rise to, which is called OWL. Okay, so the World Wide Web Consortium, who makes standards for the web, who made, for instance, XML or HTML and things like that, they were interested in having an ontology language for the web so that resources, information, everything that we see on websites could actually be annotated with semantic terms. And this would, if we all get going and people actually do this, so it's still kind of starting out, we're not there yet. But the idea is then that all the resources on the internet would not just be interpretable by humans, so we can look at a website and read it and see what it's all about, but that computers would actually have a better idea of the meaning, and this would make it much easier for computers to automatically find the things that we really care about, not just keyword matching, but something more sophisticated. Okay, so they really needed some language for this purpose, and they based it on description logics because there had been a lot of work on this branch, on this family of knowledge representation languages. And just, a historical note, so description logics really developed because for a long time, people have been interested in representing knowledge formally. And there had been some early efforts in semantic networks and certain frame languages, and these were often described in terms of pictures, and the problem is that they often didn't have a clear semantics. So I could make a picture with some arrows, and you could make a picture, and we weren't really clear on what these arrows and these circles and everything meant. Now, you can, of course, make a perfectly well-defined, semantically grounded picture-based language, and people have explored that afterwards. But the initial efforts to get, and what really got description logics going, was an attempt to actually make things clearer, to give a real semantics to what you could say with your ontology, what you could say with your axioms, okay? Okay, so this gives you kind of a basic overview of what they are about, but what are they actually? Well, they correspond essentially to fragments of first-order logic, and typically decidable fragments, because we want to pass on our ontologies to computers and do reasoning. So we want, first-order logic is wonderful. It does a lot of things. We can express a whole lot of stuff, but it is undecidable, and so we're not going to be able to have complete reasoning procedures if we allow ourselves to express things in all of first-order logic, okay? And what is nice, however, is that because we start off basically by taking first-order logic and restricting it, we have a well-defined semantics. Because we're going to be only looking at parts of first-order logic, description logics use an alternative syntax without variables, which basically makes it clear which description logic you're working with. And it also means that you kind of can't accidentally end up with full first-order logic, okay? So basically, by having a restricted syntax, it also makes sure that you can't just arbitrarily wander off into first-order logic, okay? On the other hand, it's probably the main stumbling block for people who have a logical background and try to learn something about description logics. It's what are all those strange symbols, okay? So I will show you the symbols, but if you don't master them all, it's really not a big deal. This all really corresponds, when you get down to it, to just simple formulas in first order logic.
So when it's a fragment, it's not extension, it can be extension.
Typically they correspond to fragments, yeah. That is not always the case. There are some things that do not properly, sometimes you can be more restricted in some sense and then more general in others, and so it's not a strict inclusion, it's not a strict fragment. But the vast majority of description logics do correspond exactly to fragments, yeah. Okay, what's nice about description logics is that nowadays we have a very good understanding of their computational properties. So we know which description logics are decidable. We also know some things that we'd like to add to them and make it undecidable. We have a good understanding of the complexity, so I'll come back to this later. But the idea is that we actually have a pretty good idea of what's going on here, which is really useful if afterwards you want to build reasoners and actually run them in systems. And what's nice is that also not only have we studied the computational properties, but we actually have reasoners. I mean, you can go and download right now off the web a reasoner, you can pick off an ontology, you can put it there, and you can actually run it. Okay, so that's also very nice, is that it's actually being used nowadays. Okay, so that's just the basic overview. Now I'm going to try to give you a bit more ideas about actually what can we put in a description logic ontology, what does this look like, what can we say. And then afterwards explain a little bit what is reasoning. So what types of reasoning do we want to do, and a little bit how it works. Okay? Okay, so the basics. So the basic building blocks of our description logics are what we call atomic concepts. These are simply unitary predicates. So it's just symbols denoting classes of objects. Okay? So here are some examples. So I would have liked to choose the medical domain since it seems very applied, but I felt it was a little bit easier to go with something a bit more down to earth. So my examples would mainly be dealing with animals. Okay, that I think we should all be able to understand, because I don't know much about medicine, so it's very likely that I'll just make up axioms that make no sense at all. Okay, so we have atomic concepts. This gives us different classes. Afterwards, we have atomic roles, so we're going to also be able to talk about binary relations. Sometimes called properties, so we can say that something eats something else, that an entity is a parent of another entity, that an entity has something as a part, or has a habitat, and so on. Okay? And finally, we also have what we call individuals, which are simply constants, so they denote specific entities. Okay? So here I might have Fluffy, some particular giraffe, some particular specimen, or so on. Okay? Okay, so that is the basic elements of our language. So how can we put them together? So in description logics, we don't just want to restrict ourselves to these basic classes and binary relationships. We want to be able to construct new ones, okay? To be able to describe more complex classes and relations. Okay, so what we do is we start off with our atomic ones, and then we have some constructors, okay? And these are going to allow us to make more complicated descriptions. So for instance, here I have the class of all dogs or cats. I have the class of all animals that are not carnivores, okay? So conjunction corresponds to intersection of the sets, so it's really set theoretic semantics, okay? Disjunction corresponds to union. I take the union of all dogs and cats, and negation is the complement, all things that are not carnivores, okay? And here, okay, we have plants that are carnivores. Okay, so those are the basic Boolean connectives. Afterwards, we also have restricted forms of quantification. Okay? So this first one here denotes the class of all things that are the parent of something. Why something? Because I have this little top here, which is just a wildcard and gives me everything. Okay, so it's just a placeholder. Okay? So here I'm denoting all those things that are in the first component of the parent of relation. Okay? So basically parents, right? The second one denotes all those entities that eat something that is an animal. Okay? Third one here, all those animals such that everything that they eat is a plant. Okay? Okay, so if I start off at an entity and I look at everything that they're declared to eat, it must be a plant, okay? And then also, so for the moment we're just creating complex classes, okay? We can also create complex binary relations, although we don't have as many options to make those. I mean, description logic could mainly focus on building classes rather than properties. So for instance, two useful ones are the inverse. So if I have a binary relation, I'd really like to be able to talk about it in the other direction, okay, that's natural. Or I might want to compose different roles. Say, so parent of means those things that I can access by taking two jumps on the parent of relation, okay? So, next thing, knowledge bases. So now I want to actually express some knowledge. So we typically distinguish between two types of knowledge. It's not essential, but it's helpful. And it's basically, we want to talk about generic, general knowledge, so things that happen, one class is a subclass of the other, things like that. And then we're also going to talk afterwards about specific individuals, specific entities, okay? So we separate those out. So for the general knowledge, this is in what we call a T box, T for terminology, that's historical. And this is where we're going to store all the general information, okay? So for instance, plants and animals, these are disjoint classes of living things. Giraffes are animals and they only eat leaves. Herbivores are animals and they only eat plants, and so on, okay? And then we're also, this is already interesting by itself. So actually many applications we only stop at the T-box, and already expressing things there and doing reasoning on it is already very, very useful, okay? But in many applications, we also want to have some sort of data, some specific facts, okay, about specific entities. And that we store in the A box. And so, for instance, we might say that Fluffy is a dog, Fluffy is the parent of Sparky, and this particular specimen is a Venus flytrap, okay? Something important to note is, although the A box seems a bit like a database, because we have a bunch of facts, it is interpreted in a different way. In a database, if a fact is there, it's true. If a fact is not there, it is false. So a database is supposed to store a complete description of the world, well, I mean, for the given vocabulary and for the given constants. But that is actually the way, I mean, if we look at first order logic, for those of you who are familiar, a database corresponds to a single interpretation. Okay, so it's not a theory which has many models, it's a single interpretation. Here, when we deal with an A box, the facts that we assert should be true, but facts that we do not assert are unknown. And in fact, if we then use our T box, we can infer new facts, okay? So this is what we call the open world assumption. So we don't assume that this A box contains everything that is true, it just contains some things we know to be true.
But a related question, but
yeah.
Did I understand correctly that you use classical logic and Boolean
yes.
structure? But that seems strange if you consider what
well,
you say about these opens, because saying to Chianistic structure would seem to be more appropriate, right?
Well, actually,
and how you get really Boolean structure if you have this openness?
Well, okay, the semantics that we use corresponds exactly to first order logic semantics, and that and I'll show it afterwards, but we are going to have a set of interpretations, and some of those are going to be models of our statements, and we consider those models. So, I mean, we have a bunch, our T box and A box, if I write them in logic, this just gives me a bunch of formulas. I put them together, this gives me a theory. It's a first order logic theory, nothing else. And it is interpreted exactly with standard first order logic semantics. So there's nothing strange here. It's just to note that, because a lot of times the confusion is that with this A box it looks very much like a database. And in fact, sometimes in practice it's stored in a database. But in a database, I am actually describing one specific interpretation, not a set of interpretations. And it's important to understand here that when I write down my facts, these correspond to formulas, and I'm going to be looking at all those interpretations that satisfy these formulas. But there can be very many, because if I don't state whether a fact here holds, then I have the interpretation where it holds, and I have the interpretation where it does not, and these are both perfectly coherent with respect to my...
So this, how to say, time dimension is not part of your semantic?
What do you mean time?
No, I mean, when you say opens...
you don't use time logic.
No, there's nothing temporal careful about this. People, of course, have also considered extensions. There's a billion extensions of description logics. There are also ones that treat a temporal dimension. But the standard description logics describes in a static way a domain.
No, but if I understood correctly, you say in the standard database, okay, I understood the point about the single model,
Yeah.
but also you say it's supposed to make complete distribution. If fact is not there, it's false,
Yes.
right? And that's what makes it Boolean, right? What gives you...
Oh yeah, but each of my interpretations is either yes or no. But what I'm saying is that if I don't state something here, then I can consider interpretations where that fact is true and interpretations where that fact is false. And both of them are okay. Whereas with databases, if I don't say it's true, I'm only allowed to consider the interpretation where it's false. It's like a shorthand, essentially. If I don't put it there, then it's false. So I'm only allowed to consider that interpretation. Here, we're doing normal first-order logic semantics, which means that if I don't state something explicitly, then I consider interpretations where things are true and things are false, and I have all of these, and these all give me my models.
But is the idea to use classical logic rather than, say, intuitionistic, which is, say, seems natural if you think about cryptic semantics, all this connection to knowledge. Is it, how say, are there reasons or it just...
Well, I mean, okay, you can of course consider other semantics, but even though some people might like intuitionistic semantics, also first-order logic is good in standard semantics, and for most of my understanding is that in many cases people happen to find this to be the semantics that they want. As with all things, there are intuitionistic semantics for description logics, and people have studied it. There are many alternative semantics, and people have studied this, but no one has really convinced people that, on average, that's what we should all be using. So.
But it's not a question of semantics; it's a question of your logic, right?
No, but
the rules of your logic.
Well, the rules of my logic is the semantics. I mean, this is right now. I'm just stating right here. I'm going to state what are the syntactical components. What can I write down? Afterwards, we have to say what does it all mean. You can choose various semantics. The standard one for description logics is based on classical first-order logic semantics, not intuitionistic semantics. And it seems to mainly be doing the job, so people seem pretty happy with this. But it won't, of course, necessarily work in every case, and people have considered alternative semantics. So there's nothing saying that you can't take a description logic knowledge base with its syntax and consider alternative semantics for it. And this is something that people have explored. But so far, I guess no one has convinced people that they should all be switching over to a new one. Although in some specialized cases, it does seem relevant to work with other semantics. And this is again something I was planning to discuss in my very last slide, and when I discuss kind of the different branches of work on description logics. So right now, what I'm going to be presenting in the main part of my talk is really just kind of the classical standard stuff in description logics. Obviously, a lot of times there are alternatives, and very often these have been studied. And I'll go back to at least some of these at the very end. Okay, so let's go back a bit to the syntax, and because we already kind of didn't advance the semantics, but I'll finish with the syntax and then we will cleanly move on to the semantics. So, what kind of things can we say with our T-box? So remember, the T-box states are kind of general knowledge. So we're going to have things like this, these inclusions between different classes. Which could either be simple or they can involve some of these more complex constructs, okay? So here we can say that, well, plants are living things, animals are living things, and plants are not animals. Okay. So this, of course, is very, very simple. If we stay with this, it's not very hard to do reasoning, okay? Something else we can say, well, giraffes are animals that only eat leaves, okay? So in this case, we have the giraffes, well, they're animals, and everything that they eat is a leaf. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, everything that we're stating here has exactly a correspondence to a first-order logic formula. So, for instance, if I take this one here, it corresponds to this formula. So, for all x, if I'm a giraffe, and if I eat something, then that thing is a leaf. Okay? And so all the axioms that I'm stating today, they all correspond in a very precise way to a first-order logic sentence. Yeah.
Isn't it a very bad definition of giraffe, because we can't divide giraffes and zebras, by example?
We can't what?
We can't distinguish zebras and giraffes.
Yeah, so in general, well, we'll see this a little bit here. Okay, so right here I gave essentially
very simple example.
Yeah, so this is a partial description of a giraffe. It states some things about giraffe, it doesn't state everything about giraffes, and if I don't go into more details, then indeed I won't be able to distinguish, unless I state it. In general, though, you will put more structure into your ontology, and in that case you will get different things for giraffes and for zebras. So, because they do have different properties.
Yeah.
But it is entirely possible that indeed you could have two similar descriptions for two different things. But then if you want to say that they're not the same thing, you could also put a disjointness or something like that to say that they designate different classes. Okay, so this again is the incomplete description, it states some properties. But sometimes in ontologies we actually want to completely describe one term in terms of some more basic terms. Okay, so to give an actual definition. So for instance here, when we say that herbivores are animals that eat only plants, in fact we don't mean it in the same way we mean are here. We mean it actually as in a definitional sense, in that if I'm a herbivore, then I'm an animal and I only eat plants. But also, if I know that I'm an animal and I only eat plants, then that I am a herbivore. So we can abbreviate that in this way with this equivalent symbol. And here I'm really giving a definition, which means that if I find an animal and I know that this animal only eats plants, then even if it's not stated explicitly, I can derive that it's a herbivore. So now let me move on to the semantics, which we already kind of looked at before, but now I'll give a bit more precise definition. So basically, it corresponds to taking our description logic axioms and assertions in our T-box and A-box. We translate them into first-order logic sentences. That gives us a theory, and then we look at the semantics. Okay, that's what we have, but since we are actually working with a specific syntax, we can also directly define it. We don't have to pass via translation. But what we get in the end will exactly be first-order logic semantics. I just want to stress that. Okay, so again, in first-order logic, we have interpretations. Here, we also have interpretations. They're just a bit simpler because we have less stuff in our logic, okay? So we're going to have our domain. This is just your domain of discourse, your universe, whatever you want to call it, okay? Then each of our atomic concepts corresponds to a subset of the domain. Each of our atomic roles corresponds to a pair, an ordered pair of objects. And an individual is mapped, okay, so our interpretation specifies for each individual which particular object in the domain it is, okay? Okay, so that's the basics of an interpretation, that's all it is. But, of course, we are allowed to build more complex expressions, so we have to also give the semantics of those. So the idea is that once I've specified what happens to the atomic concepts and roles, then there will be a very natural way of obtaining the semantics of the complex concepts and roles. So let's just look at an example here. Suppose that I have a concept C conjoined with D, and I want to see what does that correspond to as a set. Well, I'm just going to look, it's kind of a recursive definition, okay? I'm going to look at what is the set of objects denoted by C, what is the set of objects for D in this interpretation, and then I intersect them, okay? And likewise, if I have negation here, I take the complement. So I look at all the objects that are not in C. Okay, and so for each one of the constructors, when I define a new constructor in description logics, what I have to do is give this little definition here, which says what concretely in an interpretation, what is the operation I do to interpret such concepts. Okay, that's the first step, is we have interpretations. I'll give an example on the next slide. But what are we going to do with them? Well, as usual, we can talk about something being like a formula being satisfied in an interpretation, okay? So, for instance, here, if I have this inclusion, okay, between concepts, it's going to be satisfied in a given interpretation if I look at the set that's designated by the first one, the set that's designated by the second one, and I have an inclusion, a set inclusion, okay? That's all it is, okay? And we have that, for instance, if I have this assertion here that this individual A belongs to concept C, then what I do, I look at the particular object that designates A, and I check to make sure it belongs to the set of C's, okay? So there's a very simple way of deciding whether one of our given axioms and assertions holds or is satisfied in an interpretation. And from that, we can define the notion of a model, okay, which is just like in first order logic. So a model of our knowledge base is simply an interpretation that satisfies all of the T-box axioms and the A-box assertions. Okay, so they all correspond just to first order logic sentences, and we consider those interpretations that satisfy all the things, all the knowledge that we've expressed. Okay? Okay, so those are the definitions. Let's take a quick look at an example. So here is an example, very simple interpretation. And now we can look and check whether this particular interpretation, whether these axioms and assertions hold. So how about this first one here? Animals are not plants. Is that okay here or not?
No.
No.
Okay.
Not okay, because we have this point here which belongs on the one hand to animal and on the other hand to plant. Okay? So this is a possible interpretation, but it doesn't satisfy this knowledge we've expressed here. How about this one? Herbivores are animals.
That's right.
Yep, because we have this contained, it's actually contained here. Herbivores only eat plants.
No.
No.
No, because if we look at this particular herbivore here, it eats something that is not a plant. It's an animal, so that's no good. Okay? And what about, is Fluffy an animal? Yeah? And is Fluffy a herbivore?
No.
No, because Fluffy's here instead of animals, but not in the herbivores. Okay, so again we have really our standard interpretations, and once we've expressed some knowledge, that gives us some interpretations. Okay, the models, the ones that satisfy all the information that we've expressed. Okay, so that is basically our semantics. Now, once we have our semantics, now we're finally capable to express different reasoning tasks. Okay, so what are we actually going to want to do with our ontology? What kind of questions do we want to ask of it? Okay, so the first elementary task is satisfiability or consistency. So does our knowledge base, as we've expressed it, does it have a model? Okay? And this is very important because we need to make sure that the knowledge that we've expressed is at a bare minimum internally coherent, that we haven't written some statements that are contradictory. And of course, because it actually is quite difficult to construct ontologies, it's really important that people don't have to do this by hand. They really need that the computer can run through and check and make sure that there's no contradictions. Okay? So let's look at a quick example. So here I have a knowledge base, so I have some T-box statements, and I have this one A-box assertion here. So we have that plants are not animals, we had that before. Venus flytraps are carnivorous plants. And a particular specimen, oh sorry, I had an extra T there, is known to be a Venus flytrap. Carnivorous plants are defined to be those plants that are carnivores, and carnivores are animals that eat at least some type of animal. Okay? So is this knowledge base satisfiable? Would we be able to define a model?
No.
Okay, why not?
We have contradiction because Venus flytrap
Yeah?
should be animal and not animal.
Exactly. So we can infer that it's a plant because we have its carnivorous plant, and a carnivorous plant is a plant, so it gives us here. And we also have that it's an animal because it's a carnivore and carnivores are animals, and then if we put these together, it contradicts its first axiom. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's satisfiability. That's the first very basic reasoning task we need. Next one, subsumption. So here we want to check whether in every model some concept is a subset of another concept. Okay? And why do we want to do this? Well, first of all, we really want to understand the relationships between the different concepts that we've expressed. So some things might not be put there explicitly in the ontology, but in fact by chaining together, doing some reasoning, we're actually able to infer new relationships. Okay? In fact, one particular, a more specific task than subsumption is something called classification. So here what we do is we take all of the atomic concepts that appear in our ontology, and we do all the subsumption checks to see which ones are more general or more specific than each other. And so we can organize our ontology, our atomic concepts, into basically a hierarchy. Okay? And this is very useful for navigating the ontology, for seeing what's in it, And also, yeah, so both for understanding it and also for debugging it, because satisfiability, okay, we definitely want our knowledge base to be satisfiable, but that's a pretty minimal guarantee on the quality, right? The fact that there's no contradictions doesn't mean that it gives us the information we want. And so if we, for instance, compute all the inclusions between the atomic concepts, and then we see that there's either an atomic subsumption, like there's an inclusion that is missing, or there's an inclusion that is there that we don't think should be there, this gives us some other additional information about what might be wrong with our ontology. Okay? So this is another useful tool for checking for errors and just checking that the modeling that we've done is correct, or as far as we can tell. So let's take another example here. So here I have something a little bit more complicated. Okay, so this is a bit as before. Giraffes are animals that only eat leaves. Trees are plants, okay. Leaves are parts of trees. And now I have a bit more complex definition. I decided to write it in another way. So now I say that herbivores are animals that only eat things that are not animals. Okay, maybe this is not the right way to do it, but someone might think to write it in this way. And they only eat things that are not parts of animals, okay? Okay, so this is one way you might think of writing it. And then we have this last statement here, which maybe looks a bit complicated, but it's really not very hard. It just says that if I'm an animal, or if I'm a part of an animal, then I can't be a plant, and I can't be a part of a plant. Okay, so it just states that this is disjoint with that, this is disjoint with that. It's just, so I don't run off the slide, I put them all together in one. But that's all that it says. Okay, and so my question is it the case that my knowledge base implies this subsumption? Do I have that this axiom is entailed?
No, because giraffe is an animal, and then the animal who eats leaf, it is the animal who eats not animal, and who eats not plant animal.
Okay, so you think it's good?
Classes.
Well, no, I mean giraffe is not equivalent to herbivore, but...
No, I mean the class is something who eats leaf,
yeah,
and something who eats not animal and not a part of animal. Is it
okay, so they're not equivalent, but there is a subsumption. So indeed, if I only eat leaves, it means that I only eat things that are not animal, and I only eat things that are not parts of animals. So they're not equivalent. These expressions don't mean the same thing, but indeed this is stronger. This implies this, and this implies this. When you put it together with these, you need these three other axioms. You have to chain the reasoning together, and then you're able to infer indeed that that we satisfy these conditions, and so giraffes are herbivores. Okay, good. Okay, so another important thing is that we'd also like to do some reasoning with our A-box, right? So we have some data, we want to be able to do some reasoning on it as well. So for instance, a very simple task is to find all those individuals that belong to a given concept C. So I have some class description, I want to identify those individuals that satisfy this class, or that belong to this class, okay? Or you could do it vice versa, you could pick an individual and you want to find out which classes it belongs to, okay? And this is a very simple way of querying our A-box, okay, our set of facts. And then another way of doing some querying, which is a lot more complex, and it's become popular in recent years, is conjunctive query answering. So I won't go through all the definitions, because it would be long and it's really not necessary. But the idea is that we're going to have some sort of, we're going to have a conjunctive query, and I'll give an example on the next slide. And we want to find those tuples of individuals that always satisfy this query. They're basically answers to it. And the idea is that these conjunctive queries correspond to a very standard class of queries in databases. And so the thing is that if we want to take basically a database, but which gives an incomplete description of the world. Okay, so I have a bunch of facts, but maybe it's really big, so it's kind of like a database nowadays. And then I want to add on top of it an ontology, because I want to be able to infer additional information using some background knowledge, okay? Then people are going to be pretty unsatisfied if they can only ask these simple queries, because maybe before they were querying their data with database engines, using database languages, and they could make very complex queries. They didn't have any sort of reasoning or knowledge, but they could have complex queries. And so these people are going to be very unhappy if we take away their query language. Okay? They want to be able to say the same types, express the same types of questions as before. And so that means that in description logics, we've now moved to considering more complex queries that we can pose over our knowledge bases. Okay? And what makes them difficult is that they're complex queries from databases, but now we have a more complex setting because we also have knowledge. We have models instead of a single interpretation. So a very simple example here is, suppose that I have in a very really simple ontology here, just inclusions, okay? So mountain gorillas are primates, and mountain gorillas are critically endangered. And then I have some facts, probably have a lot more, but here are 3. So I know that Molly is a mountain gorilla who is kept at the Berlin Zoo, and the Berlin Zoo is a zoo, okay? Then a conjunctive query I might ask is something like this. So they consist of a bunch of atoms with variables and conjunctions between them, okay? So I might want to find all those pairs X and Y, such that X is a primate, and X is critically endangered, part of a critically endangered species, and X is kept at Y, and Y is a zoo, for instance, okay? And using the information here together, so this is just the facts, together with the information in our T-box, we would be able to get back Molly Berlin Zoo, okay? But if you just have the bare facts, you wouldn't be able to do this, okay? You need to have, admittedly, some very simple knowledge. Here it's really nothing more than just a hierarchy of classes, but in many realistic cases, already adding this allows you to do a lot more when you're doing queries. Okay. So those are the main reasoning tasks. So now that we've defined our reasoning tasks, we can talk a little bit about how hard it is to perform them. So if I want to make an algorithm and get a computer to do one of these tasks for me, how hard is it going to be? So there have been really very extensive investigations into the computational complexity of reasoning. People have considered a huge variety of different description logics, ranging from very, very simple things that aren't much more than taxonomies, all the way up to incredibly expressive things. Still, of course, not all of first-order logic, because we want to remain decidable, but you can really say quite a lot of things. And they've considered various reasoning tasks. So for instance, if we look at things like satisfiability, subsumption, instance checking, these turn out to basically always have the same complexity. They're interreducible. But once we move to conjunctive queries, this actually requires completely new algorithms and often has like a different complexity, okay? And there's actually a variety, I will discuss on the last slide, that there are also a lot of newer reasoning tasks that are very relevant, and for those also people have studied the complexity of them. Okay? So nowadays we have quite a good understanding. So here what I pictured, and unfortunately it comes out a bit fuzzy, is there is a website with the description logic complexity navigator, and you can click some different boxes to say which things you want to put in your description logic. And once you do that, and you click go, then it's going to display the complexity for you and also the references to where this was proven. Okay? It only handles the so-called expressive description logics. There are some more restricted ones we consider nowadays that aren't there, but it's still a useful resource. And here's just a picture which has, among the expressive description logics, all the different relationships and so on. So you can see, and this is just some of the logics that people consider. There's really a whole slew of them. Okay? Now, what is the takeaway message from all this work on the complexity of reasoning? Well, the first thing is that it's pretty bad, okay? If we look at the computational complexity, so I don't know how many of you have seen this before. So are people, for instance, have some of you seen like NP complete? Is this something you've seen? Okay, so NP complete is a class that we don't know for sure that it can't be done in polynomial time, but we strongly suspect that it can't be done in polynomial time. And so for a long time people said, oh, our problem's NP complete, ooh, we're not going to be able to handle it, okay? The case, what we know with description logics is that for most of the description logics that have been considered in the literature, reasoning, by which I mean satisfiability, subsumption, and so on, is X time hard or worse. So X time is a class of things basically that take exponential time. That's basically the definition of it, okay? And so for these, it's not just that we suspect that it's intractable, we know that it's intractable. Of course, the good news is that this is a worst case complexity result. It means that I can find some ontologies, and you have to craft really nasty things in them, okay? for which, and some data sets for which I can get this result. It doesn't mean that necessarily the things that we encounter in practice will necessarily be as bad as this. And this was why there's still hope even for the logics that have this bad complexity result. Nonetheless, it does mean that we have some challenges if we want to implement fast reasoners for these logics.
But
Yeah.
does it have to do with the fact that, say, classical logic, if I'm correct, perhaps, it doesn't have anything like computable model, right? So it's
Yeah, so the thing
that
is,
sort of logic somehow it's very different from what you have algorithmically, and that's why it just goes.
well, I guess what you can see it as is that, okay, for us, in some of our description logics, okay, I mean, first of all, a difference with first order logic is we are decidable for most of the ones we consider. The big difference is that in some cases, we do have finite models even. We can show that if it's satisfiable, it's always satisfiable in a finite model. However, the size of these models can be very large. And so basically, the size of the model that you need to look at could be exponential size. And that is what kind of gives you this here. Yeah? So there's a variety of things that come together to make it hard. Actually, different combinations of our constructors will move you to this X time. But a main idea is that even if we can either actually come up with a model, like because it's finite, or we can come up with a finite representation of a model, these typically are very large, and this is what causes problems. Yeah. Okay, so another thing that came out of all this work is that people identified useful tractable description logics, but by which I mean description logics for which we can do reasoning in polynomial time. And the thing is that in the very beginning, actually, of description logics, people, because they found out that some things were NP complete and they were very worried, so they tried to restrict things, but what they came up with were logics that were unusable. Nobody in their right mind would express knowledge using these logics. The interesting thing is that more recently, like starting from like the 2000s, people played with different ways of restricting it, and they came up with ones that are actually very relevant in practical applications and are possible, have polynomial time reasoning, so that's a very nice development. And nowadays people work really on both, because the idea is that now that we have an idea of the complexity, when you need to do some modeling, you choose the weakest logic that will meet your modeling needs, okay? So you have these complexity results to guide you, and you can see, oh, well, maybe I should try to avoid adding this because it will take me from being polynomial to something much worse. Of course, in the end, if you really need very complex modeling, then maybe that is more important than being able to go fast. Okay, just to, and I'm fairly close to the end, so don't worry. Just to illustrate a little bit this complexity versus expressivity trade-off. So this is a very standard description logic. This is actually the one that is pictured here. It says base description logic ALC. So this is a really standard one. And it basically has the Boolean things and the existential universals. Okay, so it's really natural. It's kind of naturally comes up if you take like the basic modal logics and you kind of try to find the corollary description logics. Okay, so it's very natural. And for this one, you can show is X-type complete. Okay, I already told you this is often the case. And then you can add many things to it actually and stay X-type complete, so not increase the worst case complexity. So for instance, if you add these inverses, which is a very natural construct to have, then you stay X-type complete. Okay. Now let's consider what happens with EL. So EL is a very interesting description logic. It's very simple, as you can see here. Yeah, basically we have conjunction existential, and that's just about it. Okay. Why is it interesting? Well, earlier on I discussed these big medical and biology ontologies. Turns out that for most of them, this is what you need.
What about negation? It's not as...
No, they don't really use that so much. No,
Why biologists doesn't?
I'm just saying that this does most of what you need. There's actually some weak forms of negation you can add to this to do disjoint classes. That you can add without... So simple forms of negation in the form of disjointness, you can add it, it doesn't change the complexity, so this is okay. So you need to often go slightly beyond this logic to express those ontologies, but still we are polynomial time. So this is very good because those really huge ontologies, they're really big, right? So if we use a very complex logic, it would be very hard to do. Okay, so what happens now if I take, well, it was natural to add inverse roles here. What happens if I add inverse roles to this very weak thing? Boom, we're at X-time complete. I mean, that's really surprising, right? It doesn't look particularly dangerous. I don't have negation. I don't have disjunction. I mean, and nonetheless I move up to X-time complete, which shows you that I mean, this work of mapping the landscape is actually, it's non-trivial. I mean, the results are not always obvious, and it's important for practitioners to know that when they move from this to that, they have this huge jump in complexity, and so what they can expect in terms of times for computing, for instance, the hierarchy of classes is completely different, and that's important to know. Okay, so this is my second to last slide. So just to give you a really high-level idea of what do these reasoning algorithms look like, okay? So first up, if we look at these expressive DLs, so things like ALC or beyond, okay? Then the idea would be, say, if we want to determine whether this subsumption holds, we're going to try to build a counter model. By which I mean a model that satisfies everything in T, in the T box, and such that I have an individual which is C and it's not D. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to say, okay, suppose I have this guy here who's C and not D. And then I'm going to say, well, because the T box says that, well, C implies blah, so I'm going to have to add that. And the T box says that, well, I'm either an E or an F, so I'll add E or F, and I will try out. That's a bit of what makes it difficult. I will actually have to do case-based reasoning. I'll have to say, well, if I were an E, then blah, 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 blah. If I were an F, then blah, 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 blah. And I have to see whether in the end I'm able to build a counter model or a representation of a counter model.
Is it tableau method?
Yes, exactly, here. Yeah, yeah. So this is a very classical technique which is used for many logics, and this is the underpinnings of most of the reasoners for expressive DLs. Now, if you just take the standard tableau method and you implement it, it doesn't work. So people spend a lot of time working on very clever optimizations that allow them to actually make this work on reasonably sized ontologies, so hundreds or a couple thousand axioms. Okay? And this is kind of the state of the art, and it allows people already to do useful reasoning. Okay? Now, another method that's become very popular. This is kind of a very, the basic idea is very similar to classical rule-based reasoning. So the idea is that if we're in a logic that doesn't have any disjunctions, then we're going to apply our axioms as rules, essentially, and just kind of see all the things that we can deduce, okay? We're just going to deduce more and more things, and then we're going to check whether the thing we were looking for, we derive it, okay? What makes this slightly more complicated is that we have this existential quantifier. So if I apply a rule, say, if I say that an animal has a parent who's an animal, and if I keep applying this, I could get kind of cycles. So you have to be a little bit careful to make sure that this forward chaining halts. But in the end, you are able, because there's no disjunction here, to kind of just build a larger and larger set of consequences, okay? And then to check whether the thing you want is there. And this is very helpful because we can take, for instance, that huge medical ontology snowman, so that had like 400,000 terms in it, and even more axioms. And you can classify it, so find all the relationships between the atomic concepts in a few seconds, okay? By using this type of idea, okay? So the idea is fairly simple, although you do have to do more than just what is done with traditional algorithms for rules to deal with this type of quantifications. There are still some things that have to be done to make it work. It's not completely trivial, but the underlying idea is fairly straightforward. Okay, and then a last one that is actually quite important, and unfortunately I didn't have a lot of time to cover it today, is that, okay, so I said that nowadays people are really interested in these more advanced forms of querying, like with these conjunctive queries, okay? And the problem is that they're actually quite difficult to answer, and so if we want to have, kind of database level performance, we need to work with simple, very simple ontologies, and we also, as much as possible, we like to exploit existing database tools, okay? And so people came up with this, another family of lightweight description logics called DL-Lite, and what was nice about this family of logics is that we can take our conjunctive query, and we can and then we look at our T-box, so the axioms, and we think about, well, what are all the ways that I could satisfy this query, given what I know about the axioms, okay? And then what I get in the end is a new query, which typically is actually much larger. That's a bit of an issue in practice. And this new query, it incorporates all of the relevant information from the ontology, but it's a database query. And now I can just give the database query to the database, that executes it on my A box as if it were a database, and it gives me back my answers. So in a way, I managed to reduce the reasoning task of query answering, where I have to consider what happens in many different models, to the evaluation problem of checking whether something holds in the particular interpretation corresponding to my set of facts. And a very simple example, unfortunately I didn't have space to put something a little bit more interesting, is that if I have, for instance, I want to find all the primates, okay, all the primates. And in my ontology I'm going to have things like, well, a gorilla is a primate, and a chimpanzee is a primate, and so on. Then what I can do is I can kind of make a disjunction of all the ways of being a primate, and then I send that to the database. And it looks and sees, well, is this thing a gorilla? Is it a chimpanzee? And so on, and it checks. And the answers to this database query will be exactly the answers that I want with my semantics when I take the ontology and this query. Okay, so it's a way that we kind of can compile out the reasoning. Okay. Okay, so I promised that I would conclude with some kind of current topics in description logic research. So where's the field going? And I think this will also answer some of your questions. The first thing, and here I'll be very quick because it's kind of obvious, we want things to go fast. We want this to be usable in practical applications. There's really no limits to how fast we would like this to go. And especially since now we want to deal with larger and larger T-boxes, so ontologies, larger and larger data sets, there's a real problem with scalability. So there's a lot of work to be done of building really efficient reasoners. Okay, so we've come a long way, but there's certainly a lot more to be done. Okay. The other thing is that, as I mentioned on more than one occasion during the talk, coming up with these ontologies is actually really difficult. And so we already saw that satisfiability testing or this classification, subsumption, these already give us some tools to help us figure out with what we're building is what we want. Okay? But that's not the only thing we would like. So there's actually a lot of new reasoning tasks people have come up with specifically for the purpose of helping people to construct and maintain ontologies. So the first thing is, okay, your ontology, it's unsatisfiable. It's got hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of axioms. What do? Right? You have no idea. You have no idea what to fix, right? So some people come up with services where they will find what are the axioms that are responsible for causing that contradiction, or which things are causing that unwanted inference. So if I find that in the class hierarchy things are not organized as I want, why? Okay? That's very important because otherwise it's practically impossible for someone to know what to fix. Modularity. So the idea is that people spend a lot of time, say, building SNOMED. What happens if in my application I don't need SNOMED, but I need a little piece of SNOMED? Okay, so I want to reuse parts of existing ontologies. How do I do it? So how do I automatically pick out the relevant portion of an ontology for my application? So the idea is, say, I want to say, well, these are the terms in this ontology that are interesting to me. And then I want to press go, and it gives me the subset that I need. Okay? So there's a lot of work on this, and there are tools to do it. There are a variety of ways of expressing what is a module, what is a... Yeah? Oh, okay, I thought you had a question. Okay, so, there's of course a lot of issues in just defining what is a module, what makes a good module, why, and so on. And then afterwards, actually computing it is also very difficult. A third thing, I'm going along, I'm modifying, well, there's several of us maybe working on this big ontology. I'm making some changes, and now I want to see what are the differences between different versions of my ontology. Just as people who write code use versioning tools to check what changed, we would like to have that for ontologies. The difference is that saying just that we changed this is not necessarily very useful. What you'd like to understand is what are the differences in the semantics of the two. What are the differences in the inferences between the two? So you want to have a semantic difference between the two ontologies. What do they say about the world that is different? Okay? And that also requires some effort both to define what you mean by that and to compute it. Okay. And the last thing is that, as was realized during the talk, there are a lot of types of knowledge that don't so nicely fit into the framework that we've outlined here. And okay, I'll mention a couple of them, but there's really many of them. And so, of course, people want to know, can we extend description logics, or can we come up with different types of description logics that will allow us to capture these other types of knowledge, which in some applications might be of crucial importance. So, for instance, people have introduced fuzzy description logics, just like fuzzy logic, to cope with vagueness, because sometimes people are not in a class or not in a class, they're in a class to a certain degree. Okay, you can be kind of tall, you can be very tall. Okay? Contextual information. Well, what does tall even mean? Even if we agree this to a degree, am I tall as an elephant or am I tall as a building? So some people try to come up with things where I can kind of reason about context within the description logic. Defeasible reasoning. So, I mean, obviously, both at some point in philosophy and also in computer science, knowledge representation, certain forms of non-monotonic reasoning have generated a huge amount of work because lots of common sense knowledge that we like to represent doesn't really obey the normal rules of logic. So, birds usually fly, but penguins don't. And so we'd like that if we have something that is a bird, we can conclude it flies. Now we learn it's a penguin, we don't want to conclude that anymore. Okay, so these require alternative semantics. They've been studied a lot for classical logic, but now how do we put these into description logics? And of course, since now we're really concerned about actually doing it. So a lot of work on non-monotonic reasoning. It was, yeah, what can we do with this one, what can we do with that one, but it was not so much concerned with computation. Here we actually want to have a system that does it, so this really gives us kind of new problems to deal with. And also inconsistency tolerance. Okay, so I've given you a lot of discussions about debugging ontologies and so on, but if nowadays we're going to have data, and data can be very big, data can be very dirty, we can't necessarily expect that at every time point the set of facts is coherent with the ontology. But does it mean that we have to just give up, throw up our hands and say I can't answer anything? No, because a lot of the information there is okay. And so you can adopt alternative semantics there to be able to get back meaningful answers despite the fact that you do have some contradictions. Okay? So that gives you just a little bit of an idea of where the field's going, and as you can see that it brings out a lot of classical issues in logics, in knowledge representation, and also in computation, because we really have a lot of problems to develop really good algorithms to do this. Okay, there you go.